It moves through the banquet hall the way embarrassment moves, fast and contagious and cruel, jumping from one mouth to the next until the whole room is participating in something that none of them, if asked individually, would claim to have started. 43 people at the Hargrove family reunion, summer of 2009, in the rented back room of the Lakeview Grange Hall in Millhaven, Tennessee, and every single one of them is laughing at Darnell Okafor, who is 26 years old and standing beside the dessert table with a plastic cup of fruit punch in his hand and an expression on his face that is not embarrassment, not quite, but something more complicated than that. Something that comes from a person who has learned to let the laughter of other people pass through him rather than into him, the way a screen door lets the air through but keeps the insects out. He has just said the thing that will follow him for the next 16 years. He said it to Celeste Hargrove, who is 24, who is standing next to him in a yellow sundress that her mother sewed, who has spent the last 4 months bringing him covered plates of food to the apartment he shares with 2 other men in the East Side neighborhood of Millhaven, where the streetlights work only intermittently, and the gas sometimes goes out in February, and the grocery store is a 40-minute bus ride because the nearest one closed in 2003. She has been bringing him food because he is hungry, not in the metaphorical sense that motivational speakers use to describe ambition. In the actual sense, the physiological sense, the sense in which a person's body is not receiving adequate caloric input on a consistent basis because the money is not there. He said, "Celeste, I am going to marry you when I'm rich." That is the sentence that launched 43 people into laughter. Her uncle Gerald laughs first and loudest, because Gerald Hargrove is the kind of man who laughs first and loudest at everything that confirms what he already believes. And what he already believes about Darnell Okafor is that he is a temporary inconvenience in Celeste's life, a phase she will grow out of. A man who works the loading dock at a regional distribution warehouse outside Millhaven for $11.40 an hour, and has no college degree, and no car, and no visible prospects, and no business being at this reunion at all, except that Celeste invited him. And Celeste is stubborn in the specific way of people who know their own mind so completely that the opinions of others slide right off them. Gerald's laugh is loud, and it has permission in it. And when the other people at table 7 hear permission, they follow. And when table 7 laughs, table 3 does, because table 3 has been watching table 7 all night, the way people at family reunions watch the table where the drama is most likely to occur. 43 people laughing. Darnell Okafor stands with his fruit punch and lets it move through him. Celeste Hargrove does not laugh. She looks at him, and her look is the opposite of laughter. Her look is the thing that serious people use to separate themselves from the noise of a room. A look that says, "I heard you, and I am deciding what to do with what I heard. And the decision I am making is not the one this room expects." She reaches out and takes the plastic cup from his hand and sets it on the dessert table and takes his hand instead, just takes it in front of all 43 people and all the laughter, and holds it. The laughter doesn't stop, but it changes pitch slightly, like a radio station adjusting. Darnell says nothing. He holds Celeste's hand and looks at Gerald Hargrove across the room and does not perform dignity, does not make a speech, does not demand respect. He simply is, standing in the Lakeview Grange Hall with $11.40 an hour and a promise he just made to a woman in a yellow sundress, standing in the middle of 43 people who have collectively decided that he is a joke. And the thing inside him that is not pride exactly, but is the architecture beneath pride, the structural thing that pride rests on. That thing does not move. Nobody's laughing now. That is the sentence you need to hold on to. We will come back to it. We will come back to it 16 years later, in a room that makes the Lakeview Grange Hall look like a bus shelter. We will come back to it when every single thing in that banquet hall has changed, except the two people who were holding hands, while everyone else was laughing. But first we need to understand what those 16 years cost, what they required, what Darnell Okafor built them out of, and where he learned to build, and whose hands showed him how. 14 months before the reunion, in April of 2008, Darnell's father, Isaac Okafor, dies in room 14 of the Millhaven General Medical Center from complications following his third cardiac event in 6 years. He is 54 years old. He has worked for 31 years at the Millhaven Municipal Water Authority. First as a pipe maintenance worker, then as a crew supervisor, then as senior operations manager, a trajectory that represents an extraordinary achievement and that nobody outside of his immediate family will ever think to call extraordinary, because the extraordinary things that black men accomplish in municipal infrastructure are rarely classified as extraordinary by the people responsible for doing the classifying. Isaac Okafor worked 31 years and saved carefully and owned a small house on Clement Street and put 2 children through school and died at 54 years old with a pension that will pay Darnell's mother, Ruth Ann, $412 per month for the rest of her life, which is not enough, and which Isaac knew was not enough, and which kept Isaac awake many nights in the way that insufficient provision keeps a man awake, not from guilt, but from the particular anguish of understanding the gap between what you intended for the people you love and what the system you worked inside was designed to allow you to actually deliver. Darnell is at the hospital when Isaac dies. He has been there for 3 days. He has missed 3 shifts at the warehouse, which means he has lost approximately $109 of income he does not have a cushion to absorb. He sits beside his father's bed in the last hours, and Isaac, who has been mostly unconscious, opens his eyes once and looks at his son with a clarity that seems to come from somewhere beyond the cardiac damage and the medication and the failing systems. A clarity that belongs to people who understand they are running out of time to say the things that matter. Isaac says, "You're smarter than this town will ever tell you. Don't let them do the math on you." He means, don't let other people calculate your value. Don't hand them the formula. Don't accept their quotient. Darnell says, "I won't." Isaac says, "Find the thing, whatever the thing is. Find it and go all the way." He dies 4 hours later at 6:47 in the morning, before Darnell has identified the thing, before he knows what all the way looks like from where he is standing, before anything has happened that would allow a reasonable observer to predict what is coming. He is 25 years old, and his father is gone, and he has $109 less than he should, and a job at a warehouse and a mother who will receive $412 a month and no map for any of what happens next. He keeps the job at the warehouse. He keeps it for another 14 months, through the winter that nearly breaks him when the gas goes out for 11 days in February, through the spring when the warehouse cuts his hours from 40 to 32, because the regional distribution numbers are soft, through the summer when he meets Celeste Hargrove at the public library. Of all places, both of them there on a Tuesday afternoon, Darnell reading a book about supply chain logistics that he checked out not for any class, but because something about the intersection of systems and movement had been pulling at him since a conversation he had on the loading dock with a man named Terrence, who had spent 20 years in international freight, and talked about it the way some people talk about music, with a lover's specificity. He meets Celeste at the library, and she is returning a stack of novels, and she drops 2 of them, and he picks them up, and she says, "Thank you," and he reads the titles and says he has read one of them. And she says, "Which one?" And he tells her. And she says, "What did you think?" And he tells her that too, specifically, not the vague things people say about books they have skimmed, but the actual things, the things about character and structure, and the decision the author makes in the third act that he thought was wrong, and here is why. And Celeste Hargrove looks at him with the eyes of a person who has been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone to talk to her like that, specifically, about something real. She gives him her number. 4 months later, she is bringing covered plates of food to the apartment on East Side because she understands, without making it an issue, without the condescension of charity, that he is not eating enough and that this is a solvable problem if someone who cares about him simply solves it. She solves it. She does it the way her mother taught her to solve things, which is quietly and practically and without requiring acknowledgement. Darnell eats the food. He thanks her. He does not pretend he does not need it. He does not perform independence. He accepts care with the particular grace of a person who understands that receiving is also a form of trust. And then comes the reunion, and the sentence, and the laughter. And then comes the morning after the reunion, which nobody talks about, but which matters perhaps more than the reunion itself, which is the morning Darnell Okafor sits at the small table in the apartment on East Side and looks at the window and hears his father's voice saying, "Find the thing and go all the way," and decides with the specific decisiveness of a person who has run out of reasons to wait, decides that the thing is logistics, is systems, is the movement of goods, and the optimization of routes, and the infrastructure of commerce that the whole economy runs on, and that almost nobody thinks about until it breaks, and that going all the way means not the warehouse, but the far end of the industry, the end where the decisions are made, and that the gap between where he is and where he intends to go is enormous and real and crossable. He does not have money for school. This is a factual constraint, not an emotional one. He treats it as a factual constraint and looks for factual solutions. He finds two. The first is the Tennessee Workforce Development Program, which offers subsidized certification courses in logistics and supply chain management through the community college system. The certification takes 18 months. He enrolls. He keeps the warehouse job, now 32 hours a week, and adds the coursework, and adds the studying, and subtracts sleep. Not dramatically, not in the way of inspirational montages, but in the persistent, modest way of a person who has done the arithmetic and understands that 24 hours is a fixed quantity and that the only variable he controls is how he allocates it. Celeste keeps bringing the food. She never once asks him to explain himself. She never asks if he is sure or if this is realistic or what happens if it doesn't work. She asks him what he is learning. She asks because she wants to know, because the logistics of global commerce turns out to be genuinely interesting when explained by someone who finds it genuinely interesting, and their Tuesday evenings become a standing thing. Darnell at the table with his textbooks and notes, and Celeste across from him with questions that are better than the questions on the exams, because they come from someone trying to understand, rather than someone trying to evaluate. He gets the certification in November of 2010. He is 27 years old. He applies for 11 positions. He gets 3 interviews. He gets one offer from a mid-sized freight brokerage called Callaway Logistics in Nashville, 58 miles from Mill Haven, a junior coordinator position at $38,000 per year, which is more than he has ever made, which is also not enough to immediately change everything, but is enough to change the direction of everything, which is the thing that actually matters. He takes the job. He moves to Nashville. Celeste stays in Mill Haven, where she works as a pediatric occupational therapist, a job she is exceptional at, a job that requires the exact combination of technical knowledge and human patience and creative problem-solving that Celeste Hargrove has always possessed, in quantities that exceed what her surroundings have historically known what to do with. They do the distance. It is hard in the specific ways that distance between people who love each other is hard, which are the ordinary ways. The ways that don't make good stories, but constitute the actual texture of a relationship that is trying to stay real across 58 miles and diverging daily schedules, and the particular loneliness of a city where you know no one. They do it anyway. He is at Callaway for 3 years. In those 3 years, he does something that his supervisors initially cannot categorize, which is that he treats every inefficiency he encounters as a personal problem to be solved, rather than an institutional reality to be accepted. He maps the brokerage's carrier network in his first 60 days and identifies 7 redundancies, costing the company an estimated $214,000 annually. He brings the analysis to his manager, a man named Phil Grierson, who has been in freight brokerage for 22 years, and who looks at Darnell's spreadsheet with the expression of a man confronting something he simultaneously recognizes as correct and resents as a challenge to the way things have always been done, which is the expression of a particular kind of institutional thinking that has kept many things inefficient for many decades. Phil takes the spreadsheet. He implements 3 of the 7 recommendations. He does not mention Darnell's name in the meeting where he presents them. The company saves $91,000 in the following fiscal year. Phil receives a performance bonus. Darnell sees this. He files it. He does not make a scene. He understands that what has just happened is information, not injustice, or rather it is both. But the part that is useful to him is the information, which is that what he built has value that exceeds what the institution he built it inside is willing to credit him for, and that the solution to this problem is not to build smaller things or quieter things, but to build them inside a structure where the credit flows correctly. He spends the next 14 months building that structure. He connects with 2 people, a woman named Priya Mehta, who runs technology partnerships at a freight tech startup in Atlanta, and a man named Carlos Velez, who spent 8 years at a global shipping company and knows the operational side in the specific way that only people who have worked at 3 in the morning on a dock in a rainstorm know a thing. The 3 of them have a conversation that begins as a phone call and ends 6 hours later as a business plan. The company they describe does not exist yet. It will optimize last-mile delivery routing for regional distributors using predictive algorithms and real-time carrier data. The market for this, in 2013, is not yet saturated. It is in fact not yet fully recognized as a market. They name it Meridian Logistics Solutions. Darnell Okafor is 30 years old. He calls Celeste that night. He tells her what they are building. He tells her all of it, the architecture of it, the risk of it, the fact that he will be leaving Callaway without another salary to replace it, the fact that the savings he has accumulated, $11,400, will go almost entirely into the initial operating costs, the fact that there is a real possibility this does not work. She is quiet for a moment. Then she says, "Do you believe in it?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Then go all the way." He hears his father in that sentence. She knows he will hear his father in that sentence. That is one of the things about Celeste Hargrove that cannot be quantified. Her understanding of which words carry weight and how to place them where they need to land. He goes all the way. Meridian Logistics Solutions is incorporated in March of 2013. It operates for its first 8 months out of a shared workspace in Nashville that costs $380 per month and smells permanently of burned coffee and optimism. Darnell sleeps an average of 5 hours and 40 minutes per night. He knows this because he tracks it, because he tracks everything, because one of the things Isaac Okafor taught him that nobody ever said out loud, but that Darnell understood from watching his father manage a water authority crew across 31 years, is that the people who survive the systems that are designed to exhaust them are the people who are more precise about their resources than the system expects them to be. The first client is a regional grocery distributor in Middle Tennessee who gives them a 90-day pilot and a skeptical operations director named Frank Dillard, who makes clear from the first meeting that he is doing this as a favor to Carlos's former colleague and expects to be disappointed. Frank Dillard is not disappointed. In 90 days, Meridian reduces his last-mile delivery costs by 17% and cuts his average delay rate from 12% of shipments to 3.4%. Frank Dillard becomes their most reliable referral source for the next 4 years. By 2016, Meridian has 12 employees and $4 million in annual recurring revenue. By 2018, it has 31 employees and $11 million. By 2021, a private equity firm approaches them with a number that Darnell, when he first sees it written down, reads 3 times because the number of zeros at the end of it requires confirmation. He calls Priya. He calls Carlos. They spend 6 weeks with attorneys and accountants and financial advisors whose hourly rates alone would have covered a month of his warehouse salary. They negotiate. They close. The acquisition price is $64 million. Darnell Okafor's share, after distributions to Priya and Carlos and the early investors, is $22 million and change. He is 42 years old. He sits in the same glass-walled conference room in Nashville where the papers are signed and thinks about his father's hands, which were the hands of a man who worked with pipes and pressure and systems, practical and strong. And he thinks about Celeste across a library table in Millhaven asking him what he thought about a book. And he thinks about a plastic cup of fruit punch and 43 people laughing and a sentence he made in the Lakeview Grange Hall that he has never once regretted saying. He calls Celeste before he calls anyone else. She picks up on the second ring. He says, "It closed." She says, "I know. You've been in there for 3 hours." He says, "Celeste." She says, "Darnell." He says, "I made you a promise." She is quiet for a moment. When she speaks, her voice carries something that is not surprise, because Celeste Hargrove has never been surprised by Darnell Okafor, has been many other things, proud and worried and moved and exasperated and deeply, consistently glad, but never surprised, because she understood what was in him before he had built anything to prove it with. She says, "I remember." He says, "I'd like to make good on it." She says, "You've been making good on it for 13 years. He says, "Celeste." She says, "Yes?" He says, "I'm not talking about the money." And she understands. She has always understood the difference between the promise and the money, which is that the money was never the point, was never what the promise was actually about, was only the shorthand for something else, for the version of himself he was declaring his intention to become, for the life he was saying he wanted to build toward and who he wanted to build it with, and that the becoming was the thing, not the arriving, and that she has watched the becoming, has been present for all of it, has held covered plates of food across every chapter of it. And what he is asking now is not something that requires a ring or a banquet hall or any particular ceremony. It requires only a yes. She says, "Yes." He says, "I haven't asked yet." She says, "You've been asking for 13 years." I've been saying yes for 13 years. The paperwork is just paperwork. He laughs. It is the best laugh he has had in years, the kind that comes from deep in a person, from the place where relief and joy meet. 3 months later, he asks correctly. He asks at the library in Millhaven, Tennessee, on a Tuesday, at the table where they used to sit, where he used to read logistics textbooks while she asked questions better than the exam questions, in the institution that made possible the improbable afternoon when a woman returning novels dropped 2 of them, and a man who read everything he could get his hands on picked them up and told her what he actually thought about the words inside. He gets down on one knee between the stacks in the reference section at 4:17 in the afternoon, and Celeste Hargrove, who is 40 years old and has known the answer to this question for 13 years, says yes immediately and without hesitation, and 3 people in the reference section applaud. One of them a librarian who has worked there for 22 years and who will later tell her colleagues that it was the most sensible proposal she had ever witnessed. No performance, no spectacle, just 2 people in the right place at the right time with the right answer. The wedding is on a Saturday in September. Not in Millhaven, not at the Lakeview Grange Hall. It is at a venue in Nashville that overlooks the Cumberland River, the kind of place where the light in the evening falls at an angle that makes everything look like something worth remembering. And there are 112 guests, including Ruthann Okafor, who cries from the moment Darnell appears until approximately 40 minutes after the reception ends, which is her right as his mother and as a woman who watched her husband tell their son to find the thing and go all the way, and did not live to see this, but who lives in this room anyway, in the specific way of people whose words kept walking after they left. And Gerald Hargrove is there. Uncle Gerald, who laughed first and loudest at the Lakeview Grange Hall in the summer of 2009. He is 61 now, and he sits at table 9 and watches his niece marry the man he laughed at, and he is not laughing. He has not laughed about Darnell Okafor since approximately 2018, when the news of Meridian Logistics Solutions reached him through the ordinary channels by which news of this kind reaches people who dismissed the person it concerns, which is through someone else's mention of it at a family dinner, casual and explanatory. Someone saying, "Did you hear about Celeste's Darnell?" And Gerald heard, and something in his chest shifted, not immediately to regret, because Gerald Hargrove is not a man who moves quickly toward regret, but to the adjacent thing, the awareness that a calculation he made with great confidence was incorrect, and that the confidence itself was the problem. He sits at table 9 and watches Darnell dance with Celeste, and then with his mother, and then with Celeste's mother, who is 71, and who dances with genuine joy because she has loved Darnell Okafor since the first time she met him, which was 6 months before the reunion, when she understood in the first 10 minutes of conversation that this was a young man who was going somewhere, and that the only variable was who would be with him when he arrived. Gerald watches all of this. At some point in the evening, late after the dinner and the speeches and the first dance, when people are dispersed in the comfortable way of a wedding reception that has reached its warm middle hours, Darnell crosses the room and stands in front of Gerald Hargrove at table 9 and looks at him. Gerald looks back. He says, "Congratulations, son." Darnell says, "Thank you, Gerald." A pause. The kind of pause that has things in it. Gerald says, "I was wrong about you." Darnell says, "I know." Gerald says, "I want you to know that I know that." Darnell says, "I appreciate that." He does not say it's fine. He does not say, "Don't worry about it." He does not extend a grace that would make Gerald's accountability cost less than it should. But he does not twist the knife either. He accepts the acknowledgement, and he lets it be what it is, which is late and real, and not nothing, because the question of whether an apology that arrives 16 years after the wound matters is one that each person has to answer privately. And Darnell's private answer is that it matters, partially, in the way that partial things matter, which is not enough, but not nothing. He extends his hand. Gerald shakes it. Darnell returns to the dance floor, to Celeste, to the river light through the windows, to the life that began in a library on a Tuesday afternoon and was built on a loading dock and in a shared workspace and across 58 miles of Tennessee highway and through 526 weeks of covered plates of food delivered without ceremony to a man who needed them. Nobody at this wedding is laughing. Every single person at this wedding is watching two people who earned this room. Not the way that money earns rooms, but the way that faithfulness earns them. The way that seeing someone clearly and refusing to stop seeing them clearly, across all the years and the distance and the doubt of other people, earns something that no acquisition price can replicate, and no Grange Hall laughter can diminish. Ruthann Okafor dabs her eyes at table 2 and speaks to her son's father in the way she has spoken to him since 2008, which is internally, which is in the private language of a woman who is still in conversation with someone who is no longer in the room, but whose voice she has not lost access to. And what she says to Isaac tonight is he found it, and he went all the way. And you should see this room. You should see your son. The Cumberland River moves outside the windows, doing what rivers do, which is proceed, regardless of what happens on the banks, proceed with the particular patience of things that understand their direction and trust that the destination is real even when it is not visible, even when the current is difficult, even when the banks crowd in, proceed because stopping is not the nature of the thing. Darnell Okafor dances with his wife. He is thinking about a plastic cup of fruit punch. He is thinking about 43 people laughing. He is thinking about his father's hands and a hospital room and a sentence that arrived from somewhere beyond the cardiac damage, find the thing and go all the way. And he is thinking about a library and a Tuesday and 2 novels falling on a floor and a woman who asked him what he actually thought. And he is thinking about $11.40 an hour and 18 months of certification coursework and 5 hours and 40 minutes of sleep and $11,400 in savings and $64 million at closing, and none of it, not one number of it, is the point. The point is the woman in his arms. The point has always been the woman in his arms, and the room is full of people who can see that now, who understand finally what was always true, which is that the laughter in the Lakeview Grange Hall in the summer of 2009 was not about Darnell Okafor's net worth or lack thereof. It was about their own inability to see what Celeste Hargrove saw from the first Tuesday in a library, which is that worth is not a number, and a man is not his circumstances, and the future is not determined by the present balance of an account or the assessment of 43 people in a rented room. Worth is a structure. It is built over time. It is visible to some people immediately, and to others only in retrospect. And to some people, the Geralds of the world, only when the evidence becomes undeniable, and the cost of continued dismissal exceeds the comfort of confirmed assumption. But here is the thing. The last thing, the thing that matters most, and that the wedding and the acquisition and the closed deal in the glass conference room do not actually answer. Darnell Okafor would have been worth this room without the $22 million. He would have been worth it at $11.40 an hour. He would have been worth it with $2.11 in his pocket and an empty refrigerator, and a broken spring in a pull-out sofa, and no map for what came next. He was worth it then. He was worth it in the Lakeview Grange Hall while 43 people laughed. He was worth it in the library. He was worth it every Tuesday evening across a table with textbooks and bad coffee and questions better than the exams. Celeste knew this. That is the whole of it. That is the only thing that actually needs to be said. And so we ask you this, you watching this, you who have laughed, or know someone who has laughed, or have stood in a room with 43 people laughing and felt the pull of joining them. Because the pull of crowds is real, and the cost of standing apart from them is real, and the pressure to align your judgment with the room's judgment is one of the oldest and most relentless pressures a person faces. What do you see when you look at the people in your life who have not yet arrived? What do you decide about them? What do you communicate to them through your laughter, your silence, your qualified support, your conditional belief? Because Darnell Okafor heard the laughter. He let it pass through him. He held Celeste's hand. He went home, and the next morning he found the thing and started going all the way. Not because of the laughter, not in spite of it, but because inside him was something that the laughter could not reach, something his father had named, and his mother had nurtured, and Celeste had seen, and a Tuesday library had made possible, something that exists in people before they have proven it to anyone else, before the certifications and the company and the closing, before all the evidence that the Geralds of the world require before they extend acknowledgement. That thing does not need your permission, but it will remember whether you laughed. Find the people in your life who are carrying something the room cannot see yet. Stand across from them at the table. Ask them what they think. Hold their hand when the room laughs. Bring them food when they need it. Ask them not whether they're sure, but what they're learning. And when they find the thing and go all the way, be in that room. Not because you helped make them, they were always made, but because you get to see it. And that, finally, is the gift. Not for them, for you. This is not just Darnell's story. This is not just Celeste's. This is the story of every person who has stood in a room being laughed at and held on to what they knew was true about themselves, while the room decided otherwise. It is the story of every person who saw something real in someone. The room had dismissed and loved them anyway, without conditions, without a timeline, without requiring them to prove it first. How many Darnells are in your life right now? How many people are standing at a dessert table with fruit punch, holding a promise the room thinks is ridiculous? And what they need is not for you to agree with the room, but for you to reach out and take their hand. Nobody's laughing now, but the question is never who's laughing at the end. The question is who was in the room at the beginning, when there was nothing to see yet, and chose to see it anyway. Be that person. That is everything. That is the whole thing. Be the person who sees it before there is anything to see, and means it, and shows up with food, and asks better questions than the exam, and holds on across 58 miles, and 16 years, and 43 people laughing, and says yes already, before the question is even finished. That is how a life is built. That is how a promise is kept. That is what it looks like when nobody, finally, is laughing.